determinants which are formed by reason, God's reason, and God's reason through various ways enlightening man's reason. Now, in the last program I talked to you how this generally occurs, which is the whole idea of law. Law. Whether it's God's providence, which he has in his mind when he creates the world, how I understand God's providence generally, guiding my conduct, which is the natural law, how this is made more specific in certain situations in human communities, which is the positive law, the law that human beings make, or the civil law, or ecclesiastical law, like the canon law, and then finally how God himself directs and informs me, and that is through the Old and the New Testaments, the New Testament being the final perfection of the law. In addition to this, because moral actions are about specific judgments that are made concerning specific kinds of conduct, I also have a source in the order of reason by which I must guide and direct my actions. And this is not just the source in general, but it's the source which I deal with every day and which I find deep within myself. It's the place where I apply the law of God, which I know in general, either through the natural law or through the civil law or through the revealed law, where I apply this law to the formation of my own judgments concerning what I should do here and now. This is called the conscience. The conscience is an implementation of reason. The conscience therefore involves intelligence. It is not just feeling good about something. Well, if it feels good, do it. Oh, Father, I love him. I feel so good in his presence. It's true that he beats me. It's true that he's a drunk. It's true he can't hold a job. But my love will change him. Here we have someone who's blinded by their passions to make judgments in a certain way, and they don't listen to their conscience, which should tell them to form their conscience according to more human criteria. So they marry the person, and when the passions change, it's like taking off your glasses and you look at the world in a clear perspective. When the passion dies, the person goes, what did I marry? Because they couldn't think clearly. Conscience is where we have to apply the law of God to the given actions which we perform. Conscience is related to the virtue of prudence. But the difference is that whereas in both conscience and prudence I have to have information, I have to inform myself, I have to do this by taking counsel of other people and making judgments, conscience ends in the judgment of reason. Prudence ends in guiding reason according to that judgment in my will, according to what's good or evil. So it's possible for a person, their conscience, to say such an action is evil, I should not do it, but because of some moral weakness, to actually do it and act contrary to their conscience. Conscience then is a syllogism. Now what's a syllogism? A syllogism is a logical construction. A logical construction that involves a major, a minor, and a conclusion. In this logical construction, you, first of all, when it comes to morals, have as the major premise, in other words, the thing that guides all of your judgments and reasoning in this, the statement that guides and governs all moral activity. From the point of view of reason, that's either do good and avoid evil, or if you're dealing with a Christian context or a Jewish context, the law of God, this is according to or contrary to the revealed law of God. Now, then you implement this by having a judgment in a more specific case. This is like the minor of the syllogism. For example, adultery is contrary to the law of God, and therefore it's forbidden. Or giving alms is in accord with the law of God, and therefore it's something I should do. Then, what makes this different from a class, where I could sit there and discuss this, is then I have to actually carry it out in my everyday life by my everyday judgments. So, do good and avoid evil. Adultery is evil. This particular action is adulterous because it involves having use of the sexual act outside of marriage. Therefore, that's the conclusion, I must not do it. Not I could not do it, but I must not do it. And it's the identification of goodness with our human nature that gives the force to this judgment, I must not do it, as involving either my becoming more perfect as a human being or denying my perfection as a human being. If I act contrary to this judgment, then even though I might feel good, and there are some good things about this action, an adulterous action, for example, can bring forth children, I denied justice toward another human being, justice toward my wife, justice toward God, because of the very nature of what the marriage covenant is all about. And I should affirm those things. Those are goods. I should do these, and therefore I experience a complete interior lack in myself of some perfection. In other words, I experience a disorder. Now, since conscience involves knowledge, and since it involves logic, I'm sure you're aware that a lot of us are not very logical. There are people who think that conscience today is an oracle, an infallible judge. Just because in my conscience I think this is true, that means it is true. Obviously, if our reasoning can be illogical about something like mathematics or the nature of our heart, the same thing is true concerning our judgments concerning ourselves. In other words, my premises could be wrong, or the way I construct them, because I'm not a very logical person, could be wrong. Also, in the last 400 years, there's been a lot of difficulties examining conscience. The whole problem of the formation of conscience came to the fore in Catholic morals because of this difficulty in obtaining certainty and knowledge that I talked to you about when I talked to you about Descartes. Because the Protestant Reformation did away with certainty in religious knowledge and did away with the authority of the church, and because the discoveries of Galileo did away with certainty in philosophical knowledge by seeming to undercut everything in people like Aristotle, even though it was only about one particular little conclusion in Aristotle that didn't affect his general philosophy, people sought to recover certainty in knowledge, and that included certainty in moral knowledge. They wanted a kind of absolute certainty in this regard. And different schools of thought arose in Catholicism by different religious orders or different interpretations about how you obtain certainty in that knowledge. So you had these schools, they have weird names because they come from Latin terms: probabilism, probabiliorism, equiprobabilism, laxism, all this business, which sought to discuss how the conscience was informed and what kind of mitigations there could be if the conscience wasn't formed correctly, and what authorities should be used to form the conscience. Now, what I would say is that where you have a lax conscience, in other words, where you really don't care what the teaching authority of the church says or whatever, that's a problem. If someone comes into confession to me and says, well, I know the Pope says birth control is wrong, but he's wrong, my conscience is much more important than that, then I would say that this is a position that cannot be maintained. If you're interested, sometimes there are all kinds of interesting reflections on this in the movie The Man for All Seasons, very famous movie. If you haven't seen it, I recommend it to you. Won all kinds of Academy Awards. And it's about the life of Thomas More and his death. In this movie, the king comes to visit Thomas More, and he says to him that he has no queen, Catherine's not his wife, no pope can make him so. All the popes back to Peter cannot come between me and my conscience. My conscience has judged her not to be my wife. And then when Thomas More is condemned to death, he expresses his opinion concerning the indictment against him, namely that he refused to sign the act which makes the king the head of the church. And he says the indictment is based on an act which is directly repugnant to the laws of God and his church, the supreme government of which no temporal person may by any law presume to take upon himself. What's more, the immunity of the church is guaranteed in Magna Carta and in the king's own coronation oath. It is therefore insufficient in law, according to my conscience, to charge any Christian to obey it. Because even though the law is the source of the formation of our conscience, remember, if laws are not according to the truth, they cannot bind the conscience. So, it's necessary for us to have some certainty. We cannot act with a perplexed conscience, for example, in which we're not sure that one truth or the other truth is true. We have to do all we can to resolve our perplexity, all the things that are open to us. But we must do this according also to the authorities presented to us in our church. So, conscience is an implementation in reason of general laws to particular conduct. It cannot change, for example, the teaching of the church that maintains that something is always evil and everywhere, like contraception, and make it good just because in your particular context you think it's helpful and useful to you. The problem of the erroneous conscience I will examine in the next segment, because it's a problem that was very difficult in the Middle Ages, and St. Thomas has an interesting solution to that. So we'll be right back.
Family, let us observe
the actual place where human beings as individuals apply the general law of God to their here and now activities, the conscience. Many people today have exalted the conscience so that people say, I cannot be criticized as long as I'm following my conscience. Some ecclesiastics have stated that when it comes to judgments concerning contraception, that each of the Christian faithful have to form themselves according to their conscience, but they give no guidance to this. I remember I knew a lady in Los Angeles, and she was asking a priest a question concerning a proposed kind of moral conduct. And the priest said to her, well, let your conscience be your guide. And her answer was, well, if my conscience could be my God, I wouldn't be asking you. I need to inform my conscience. Conscience has to be informed by reason, it's true, but remember, authority has more force of law when it comes to revelation, because in revealed ideas, we don't understand them fully, we're given them by God. And therefore, who makes the teaching should be of an important source for us. Papal teaching is obviously the most important source of all. So if a pope in an encyclical says, for example, each and every marital act must be open to the transition of life, and you by your conscience say, well, I form my conscience to say that's not true and therefore I don't have to follow it, that's not a sufficient position for a Catholic. Even more so, to claim that you have the right to dissent from papal teaching in your conscience wouldn't be correct. You know, Vatican II had this document on the freedom of conscience regarding religion, Dignitatis Humanae. There are some Catholics who maintain that this document is true not only in the civil order, because the whole weight of it is that the civil order's responsibility isn't really for religion as such, and therefore a person has to remain free to form their conscience according to the truth. They can't be forced to be a member of any religion. They maintain that as Catholics, this is also true regarding things like papal teaching. There is no right to dissent from papal teaching. We have a right to hear papal teaching, to have it explained to us, and to form our conscience accordingly. Why? Because our consciences can be erroneous. They can be mistaken. If they're unformed, or you judge them just by your emotions, or what, I don't know, the popular media tells you, this is not the same as the revealed law of God. Now, Does an erroneous conscience bind a person to action? This was a famous problem in the Middle Ages. Since the truth has to guide the will, there were many theologians in the Middle Ages who maintained that an erroneous conscience wasn't binding. Only a correct conscience, and a certain conscience that was correct, was binding. St. Thomas maintained that this was an impossible position. Why? Because an erroneous conscience is still a conscience. In other words, it speaks to you as a person in the depth of your heart with the authority of God. If it's contrary to what God has actually revealed, you still perceive it as speaking to you with the authority of God. So what St. Thomas said was this: if you follow an erroneous conscience, you commit a sin. If you act against an erroneous conscience, you also commit a sin. If you act against an erroneous conscience, you act against what the case actually is. If you act against your erroneous conscience in the personal judgment, you act against what you perceive it to be. So, in other words, you can't avoid sin as such. He says, is this a dilemma though? Does this mean that a person can't avoid sin? He says, no. Because a person can always change their conscience. They can't act against their conscience as long as it's formed in a certain way. But they can seek further information, and by receiving further information, they can have that affect what their judgment is in the here and now situation. And if the conscience can be changed, then it must be changed. In other words, if it's possible for you to know the truth, then you have a moral obligation to seek the truth. And once you've sought it, to change your opinion accordingly. I remember one time in the religious life we had a superior who did something contrary to our law, to our constitutions, and we were sitting discussing this, and one of the priests said, well, that person had invincible ignorance. Now remember what invincible ignorance is? That's ignorance that becomes before the will and you can't change it. So in other words, you couldn't have known. I said, Father, the book of the law is sitting above his head on a bookcase. He has the freedom to take it down and open it up and read it. It's not hard to understand. It's not possible to maintain that this is invincible ignorance. It's not possible to maintain that he couldn't have informed himself in such a way to know that his proposed course of action was wrong. You can't excuse him because of that. On the other hand, if it's not possible for a person to know the truth, then of course if they enter into this action, even though their action is evil in itself, even though it's wrong, they're not held responsible for this wrong because they couldn't have changed their idea about things. So, in your conscience, what you do is you consult either a proposed course of action or an action which you've actually done. You consult your conscience to find out if what you perceive to be good or evil actually was. A conscience which perceives an evil action, where you actually realize what you thought was evil really is good, excuses you. A conscience which looks at a good action, which you thought was good, but you perceived to be evil and you could have known that, that accuses you. And in a proposed course of action, it means that either you shouldn't do it if it's evil, or you should do it if it's good. Now, what could be the origin of a conscience which is mistakenly formed through the person's own fault? Well, the Catechism of the Catholic Church, interestingly enough, discusses this, and also, interestingly enough, uses the supposedly most liberal document in Vatican II, the document on the Church of the Modern World, to explain this. This is what it says. A human being must always obey a certain judgment of his conscience. If he were deliberately to act against it, he would condemn himself. Yet it can happen that moral conscience remains in ignorance and makes erroneous judgments about acts to be performed or already committed. This ignorance can often be imputed to personal responsibility. Remember, you could change it, and if you can change it, you should. This is the case when a man, quote from Vatican II, takes little trouble to find out what is true or good, or when conscience by degrees is almost blinded through the habit of committing sin. In such cases, the person is culpable for the evil he commits. Ignorance of Christ and his gospel, bad example given by others, enslavement to one's passions, assertion of a mistaken notion of the autonomy of conscience, where you can do whatever you want, rejection of the church's authority. Does a man need a pope to tell him when he's sinned? I don't care what the pope says, I don't think it's a sin. Rejection of the church's authority and her teaching, lack of conversion and of charity. These can be at the source of errors of judgment, of moral conduct, and they're errors that we're responsible for. If, on the contrary, the ignorance is invincible, or the moral subject is not responsible for his erroneous judgment, the evil committed by the person cannot be imputed to him. It remains still an evil, a disorder, but the person isn't guilty. One must therefore work to correct errors of moral conscience by teaching the truth. And unfortunately, some people today, even some authorities, even some priests, refuse to at least teach the truth in certain teaching moments to try to help people to form their consciences correctly. So, when you say, as long as my conscience is guiding me, I know what I'm doing is right, this is true of a correct, certain conscience. To change this conscience will be a sin. But it's not true of a mistaken conscience. A mistaken conscience can be changed. If you're able to do it, then you must do it. I would hope then that people who try to form their conscience, who may be listening to this talk, contrary to the authority of the papacy and things like contraception, would try to look again at what's involved in their decision so that they might form their consciences in the way a Catholic's conscience should be formed correctly. People may be weak in carrying out the teaching of the Church. We're all weak. That's one matter. But to say the teaching of the Church is wrong and I can dissent from it and I don't care what the authority says, that's another matter. So yes, conscience involves a practical judgment here and now of how God speaks to me. But I could be mistaken about that, and that's why I need exterior authorities to guide and direct me. Here again we see that freedom is best served in us when it's not looked upon as freedom from the truth, but looked upon as freedom for the truth. And the formation of a true and correct conscience is essential to that truth. Only when that truth prevails among us can we truly say that our conscience is correct, and we truly know that we're not following our personal whims, but instead we're following what God has created us to be. I bless you in His name, in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.